Placing his hands on the table, Balasan began to stare intently at Vikir and called his attention. Our boy who was sitting in front remained silent. The attention of all the students focused on them, and their eyes widened with fear, realizing that there was going to be a fight. With a furious gaze, Balasan clenched his teeth and asked if Vikir was the strongest first-year student at Kalyasio Academy. Instead of panicking, our boy stayed calm and began to ponder silently. Not long after, Balasan forcefully placed his elbow on the table. He sat across from Vikir, and while his eyes were shining with hatred, suggested an arm wrestling match without mana to see how strong Vikir really was. With a lost expression, Vikir began to gaze at the ground in silence and did not say a single word. Balasan's eyes began to shine, and an arrogant smile appeared on his face upon seeing Vikir's attitude. He mocked our boy by asking if perhaps he was feeling afraid, and if so, he could admit it without problem. He would be quite impressed with the level of Kalyasio Academy if someone like him was considered the strongest. Upon hearing this, the eyes of Bianca, Piggy, Sinclair and Tudor filled with rage. They began to stare at Balasan and couldn't help but feel furious. Just then, someone decided to put an end to this. It was Dolores, with an angry expression. She placed her hands on top of the table, started staring intently at Balasan and made it clear that she wasn't going to allow conflicts between academies before the tournament. The attention of our boy fixed on her. He was somewhat confused. Everyone noticed that she was Dolores Lankovadis, the president of the student council of the Coliseum Academy. Balasan began to gaze toward the table in silence. With a serious expression, Dolores asked them to stop playing children's games and suggested going to bed early for the tournament. At that moment, a muscular man began walking toward them and caught their attention. He placed his hand on Balasan's shoulder and seeing that the energetic young people had a small conflict, he asked Dolores if she didn't think it was going to be fun. Feeling this, Balasan turned his head and his eyes widened with confusion and surprise. With eyes shining with excitement, a red-haired man began to show a smile. He was Bakira. Dolores' attention was fixed on him and her eyes widened in surprise and astonishment. She didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, on the other side, Vikir, who was sitting next to her, remained calm. He was Geragio Bakira. Seeing that even the president of the student council of Boot Camp Varangia had come, people became confused. Bakira placed his hands on his waist, began to observe her with a serene gaze and mentioned that Balasan had put at stake his own name and the honor of the first-year students of Boot Camp Varangia by proposing a duel. He asked Vikir for his opinion, reminding him that he was considered the strongest man among the first years at the academy. His eyes began to shine with joy and an excited smile appeared on his face. He wanted Vikir to accept. Vikir remained silent, not knowing what to say. Dolores began staring intently at Bakira and mentioned that she understood what he meant, but if it couldn't be done, it couldn't be done. While Bakira's eyes were shining with joy, he placed his hand on Balasan's shoulder and with a smile began to point to the side with his finger, revealing that Balasan was desperate to show his strength and also asked them to look. With a gaze full of determination, Balasan began to snort smoke from his nose, desperate to arm wrestle Vikir. Not far away were Bianca, Sancho, Tudor, Piggy and Sinclair. Their eyes were shining with rage. They could endure being insulted, but they would not allow anyone to insult their friends. Bakira revealed that they too were desperate for Vikir to show his strength. They clenched their fists and began staring at Balasan with a piercing gaze. The Loris' attention was fixed on them, and her eyes filled with concern. With a nervous expression, she began to ponder in silence, knowing that if she used her authority to force them to withdraw authoritatively, it could affect the morale of the first-year students before the tournament. Nevertheless, the safety of the students was her priority. Vicar began to observe her attentively with a curious gaze. He did not know what she had in mind. Then, he raised his head, and while his eyes were shining, he began to stare at Balasan in silence. Bakira put his arm around Balasan's neck and with a smile thought that Vicar was afraid of being hurt. He promised that the gain would be done with moderation. Upon hearing this, Balasan's eyes filled with fear and confusion. Vicar began to imagine Bakira from the past, remembering that Geragio Bakira, before his regression, had been one of the great heroes of humanity's united forces. During his time at boot camp Varangia, because his grandparents were originally from Suhi, he had suffered discrimination. But despite this, he fought against fourth-year students and became a legend for having dominated the academy. In the confrontations with the Varangia boot camp, led by Bakira and with strong cohesion, he learned not to be underestimated and to earn respect. The Loris moved away from the table and began to observe Vicar in silence. Bakira, who was standing next to Balasan, remained silent, waiting for Vicar's response. Vicar began to gaze at the ground and agreed to have an arm wrestling match with Balasan. Upon hearing this, Bakira closed his eyes and couldn't help but laugh. He was so excited that he started choking Balasan, who began screaming for help. With a worried gaze, the Loris asked if Vicar was sure about this. Our boy stood up and began to ponder. Although he was going to draw some attention, if he obsessed over trivial things, he would lose the essence. He began to gaze at the ground, then started pointing at Bakira with his finger and said that he wanted to have an arm wrestling match with Bakira instead of Balasan. Upon hearing this, their eyes filled with confusion and surprise. No one knew what was happening. Balasan's eyes filled with rage. The jaws of all the students, including the Loris, dropped in surprise. They couldn't believe that Vicar wanted to have an arm wrestling match with Bakira. With eyes shining with fury, Balasan clenched his fist and made it clear that he was Vicar's opponent. Just then, Bakira put his hand forward and an excited smile spread across his face. Seeing this, Balasan felt confused and his eyes filled with fear. He didn't know what he had in mind. Vicar began to show a determined expression, and noticing this, Bakira realized that he wasn't joking. With eyes shining with excitement, Bakira rested his elbow on the table, and while his body was releasing an immense amount of mana, with a smile he decided to accept having an arm wrestle with Vicar. Our boy also rested his elbow on the table and grabbed Bakira's hand, both prepared for an arm wrestle. The Loris stood next to the table, and with a serious expression she said that the rules were simple. The result of the arm wrestle would be decided by a clear victory, defeat or surrender, with an expression full of determination. Vicar prepared to defeat Bakira. The Loris' attention was fixed on him. With a gaze full of concern, she revealed that she would stop the duel if she noticed any risk of injury. Both grabbed each other's hands tightly, and the Loris asked them to get ready. At that moment, our boy began to apply some force, and upon noticing this, Bakira's eyes filled with surprise. He didn't know what was happening. An excited smile appeared on our boy's face. The Loris gave the signal for the duel to begin, and both started applying force. Not long after, Bakira began to gain the advantage, but our boy focused since he wasn't going to lose this arm wrestling match. All the students felt excited and began cheering. One of Balasan's friends put his hand under his chin and felt confused. He thought that Vikar would lose as soon as they started, but he wondered how, with that body, he could withstand Bakira's strength. The other man's eyes filled with surprise. According to him, this was not possible. He assumed that Bakira was not using all his strength because he was afraid of breaking Vikar's arm. With eyes shining with seriousness, Balasan clenched his fist and began shouting, asking Bakira not to hold back. Piggy put his hands on top of his head and felt worried for Vikar. Sinclair's eyes filled with worry and surprise. She didn't know what was happening. Tudor's eyes widened in surprise. He had felt that Vikar was strong, even in the match against Neftali, but he did not expect that he could stand up to Bakira. Sancho was in shock as he couldn't believe how strong Vikar was. With a curious gaze, Tudor began to observe closely and mentioned that if Bakira was doing this seriously, they could really expect Vikar's victory. The arm wrestling match was intense. Bakira clenched his teeth tightly and decided not to lose against our boy. Dollars began to watch attentively. Bakira's hands started trembling and he clenched his teeth tightly. He couldn't believe that Vikar was so strong. His eyes widened in confusion. He had been thinking of ending this arm wrestling properly by controlling his strength, but at the moment when he had taken his hand, his thoughts had changed. He began to imagine Vikar's muscles surrounded by mana. He thought about how the load weighed through the triceps and shoulders, and the shape of the hand was designed to maximize the strength of the forearm muscles. He realized that, although he himself was ahead in the weight category, Vikar's technique was on a completely different level. He began to imagine himself dragging a mountain. He felt that, setting aside technique, it was like a rocky mountain, like trying to forcefully pull an enormous rocky mountain. With his face full of sweat and a smile, he mentioned that the way Vikar used his power seemed to him like that of a veteran who had been through everything. He found him as experienced as his own father and wondered how it was possible. He felt curious to know who Vikar really was. Our boy began to gaze toward the ground in silence. Vikar began to speak in the language of Bakira, revealing that he was the hunting ground. Upon hearing this, Bakira's eyes filled with fear and surprise. With shining eyes, Vikar began to stare at Bakira, revealing that he was the hunting ground of Balak. Vikar decided to stop playing and began to use all his strength, slamming Bakira's hand against the table. His strength was so immense that smoke began to emerge. Seeing this, Bakira clenched his teeth tightly. Dolores put her hands over her face. She didn't know what was happening. Everyone else's eyes filled with confusion. No one could see ahead since a dust storm had suddenly appeared. Once the curtain of dust disappeared, the broken table could be seen and Vikar lying on the ground in Bakira's standing. No one knew who had won. With a confused gaze, Bakira began to look at his hand just before he could admit defeat. Vikar, who was sitting on the ground with a serious gaze, admitted that he had lost. Everyone started cheering for Vikar for having fought well and for having endured so long against someone as strong as Bakira. Bakira clenched his fist tightly, knowing that Vikar had let him win. He began to walk toward our boy. Vikar's attention focused on him and his eyes began to shine. They both shook hands and, speaking in the language of the tribe, Bakira admitted that Vikar was the pride of the deep forests. His eyes began to shine with joy, and he swore never to forget Vikar. He grabbed Vikar's arm and raised it in the air. With a smile, Bakira mentioned that Vikar had incredible strength for having been able to withstand his power. Our boy remained silent. Sancho's eyes began to shine with joy, and a smile spread across his face, realizing that this was a friendship between men. Tudor crossed his arms and couldn't help but smile, since according to him Bakira was great, he was a real man. Piggy clenched his fists and his eyes began to shine with excitement. His heart was racing at full speed. He really wanted the day of the tournament to arrive. It was night, and with the burning passion of men, the first day before the competition was slowly coming to an end amid intense heat. And finally, the true day of the University League arrived. Inside the tower was the management office of the Magic Tower, the master of the Magic Tower. Blue Whale began stroking his beard and mentioned that it was an honor for him to have them in the tower for this year's competition. In front of him was a woman with brown hair. She was the Masira's director named Hippolyte, and a man with a scar on his face. He was general of boot camp Varangia named Basilios. Also present was Banshee Mork, deputy director of Colosseum Academy. They were all seated around a hologram. Blue Whale thanked everyone for having made their way to the Magic Tower and expressed his gratitude. Hippolyte began to point at the hologram with her finger and mentioned that the extra eye of the Magic Tower was always amazing. Basilios couldn't help but smile since he could see all the students who were inside. With a smile, Blue Whale said it was true. You could see what the 400 students were doing. In the hologram, red dots could be seen. This year's survival competition map was the enemy and the Black Mountain. Everyone began to watch closely, and somewhere was Vikir, and behind him there were monsters staring at him. Blue Whale asked if they didn't feel great curiosity about how the students would survive in this infernal map. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, it was daytime and the sun shone high in the sky. That day marked the beginning of the Survival Olympiad. The tournament would take place in the Magic Tower, a place made up of countless spaces whose height and width were impossible to measure. Inside it awaited this year's map for the survival tournament, the jungle of the Red and Black Mountain. When night fell, Sancho and the others grabbed their weapons and began to run through the jungle. Their eyes shone with determination, and each one had the assigned health points. They were aware that students from each school were summoned at random locations by teams, and the most important rule of the tournament was to survive by adapting to the relentless environment of the mountainous jungle, without letting their assigned HP shield reach zero. At that moment, a monster stomped on the ground with force to gain momentum. Noticing this, Piggy's attention fixed on it, and his eyes filled with fear and surprise. A giant monster with eyes shining with fury appeared in front of them and began to roar. Sancho and the others stopped running, and their attention was fixed on the monster. The monster clenched its fists and lunged at them. It landed on top of them and struck with all its strength, breaking the ground into pieces. Sinclair's eyes began to shine with seriousness, and using her powers, she summoned a powerful shield around them to protect from the monster's attack. Sancho, who was standing in front, grabbed his axe and started staring at the monster. He was the tank, Sinclair was the healer, Piggy was the strategist, Tudor was the DPS, and Bianca was the archer. There existed a rule that allowed participants to survive by fleeing from magical beasts of the jungle or, on the contrary, hunting them to earn points. With a serious gaze, Piggy turned to Tudor and said, that they would distract the beast until the next attack. He also told Sancho that, once his shield was depleted, he should take care of escorting Sinclair and Bianca. Tudor began to observe Piggy and nodded his head. Then, Piggy turned to Bianca and Sinclair and asked them that, while he and Tudor distracted the beast, they should aim at its vital points. Sinclair, who was holding her magic staff, and Bianca began to observe Piggy and nodded their heads. The monster became enraged, clenched its fist, and began charging toward them, ready to attack again. Seeing this, Piggy and the others started running toward it and decided to set off. They were willing to defeat this beast. With a furious gaze, the beast attacked with all its strength, but Tudor jumped and dodged the attack, making its fist hit the rocks. With a worried expression, Piggy crouched down and also dodged the attack at the last second. The monster got even angrier and started hitting with all its strength, and while it was distracted, Sinclair extended her hands and applied a buff to Bianca. She stood up and began aiming at the monster with her bow, ready to shoot. Sancho stood in front of them to protect them from a possible attack. Several seconds passed, and seeing that Bianca still hadn't shot the bow, Tudor's eyes filled with confusion. Sinclair grabbed her magic staff tightly, closed her eyes and concentrated. Bianca's eyes, who was aiming at the monster with the bow, began to glow. She started to concentrate all her power on the tip of the arrow and mentioned that she was almost ready to shoot. After charging the attack, she fired. The arrow was so powerful that it pierced part of the monster's body. Not long after, it lost its life and fell to the ground. Piggy turned around and his eyes widened in surprise since the monster had been very close. Tudor, who was observing the course of the monster, couldn't help but wonder if Bianca had shot late on purpose. Bianca placed her hands on her waist and with an arrogant expression mentioned that she shouldn't have bothered saving Tudor and thought that maybe she should have shot later. Once she opened her eyes, she felt somewhat confused. The eyes of Sancho and Sinclair filled with fear and concern. They panicked and asked Tudor and Piggy to run away. Tudor and Piggy turned around and felt somewhat confused. They were not aware that a powerful burst of fire was approaching them. The burst of fire exploded, creating a great explosion in the area. The person who had summoned the burst of fire extended his hand toward them and felt furious and called the students from Colosseo Academy insects. It was none other than Philippus. He extended his hand and while his body was surrounded by powerful flames, with an arrogant expression made it clear that, for him, it made no sense that they were above the magic tower in the hierarchy. Currently he had 83 HP points. The reality was that prey that could add points could also be people. Granel was walking through the jungle. He had 77 HP points. His eyes were full of exhaustion and his face full of sweat. Using his hand, he wiped the sweat. His energy vanished just by walking through the forest, and he wondered how it was possible that a hellish jungle like this existed in the real world. He also questioned where the hell the others had gone. He began to imagine Vicar and the Baskerville triplets. Granel started sweating like crazy, and his eyes widened with rage upon noticing that they had ventured so recklessly, and he couldn't help but wonder if they had already been eliminated and teleported to the waiting room. He began to remember what had happened in the train car. According to him, they were complete useless people. He thought with regret that if only he hadn't let his guard down that time, he would have put those guys in their place properly. Just then, a strange aroma began to spread through the air, and this caught Granul's attention. He couldn't help but blush and put his hand over his stomach. His mouth watered as it was the smell of food. He wiped his mouth with his hand and, with a smile, began to follow the trail of the smell. Giving off the aroma of food in the middle of the forest was like putting up a sign that said, "I'm here, come get me." Not long after, in the distance, he saw a campfire and thought he had found free food, but to his surprise, he triggered the trap that was on the ground. Upon feeling this, he looked down, and his eyes widened in fear and surprise. The rope wrapped around his foot, lifting him upside down. Granul panicked and started screaming like a madman. He didn't know who had set the trap and demanded to be brought down immediately. The person who had set the trap was an archer. They began walking toward Granul and felt somewhat confused to see that he had triggered the trap. Granul's attention fixed on them and his eyes widened in surprise, leaving him in shock. The people who had placed the trap were none other than Vikir and the triplets. Our boy had 100 HP points, while the others had 95, 96 and 97. Vikir began to gaze at the ground. The triplets put their hands on their waists and began to look at Granul with contempt. For him this was a disgrace. They deactivated the trap and brought Granul down, and then they sat around the bonfire. While the triplets were silent, Granul sat next to Vikir and began to show a forced smile. They started to prepare some meat on the bonfire. Granul's attention was fixed on the tent, and his mind was filled with surprise. There was not only food but also an improvised tent, which made him wonder who could have done all this. The triplets began to stare at him. High Burrow said that the commoner Vikir had done all this. Middle and Low Burrow nodded their heads. With a curious expression, Granul began to point at Vikir with his finger and asked if a commoner had done all this, dismissing the idea as a lie. He wondered how a nobody like Vikir could achieve something like this. Our boy began to gaze toward the ground in silence. The triplets began to stare at him, and their eyes started to shine with rage. Granul raised his hands and panicked, saying that he just wanted to know how Vikir had done all this. The smell of food began to pass under Granul's nose. He couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly and feel furious. He wondered why he, a member of the 7 great families, had to worry about the opinion of a damn commoner, and also had the feeling that those idiots from the Baskervilles were covering for him. He put his hand over his stomach and let out a sigh. Vikir and the others began to watch in silence. The triplets couldn't help but laugh at him. Noticing this, Granul felt even more furious. He was so humiliated that he wished to die. Vikir brought a piece of meat close to Granul's face and mentioned that they were roasting it to attract monsters, but if he wanted, he could eat a little since they had already eaten. His attention focused on it, and his eyes widened in surprise. His mouth watered. He began to extend his hand to grab the piece of meat and asked why Vikir was being generous with him. The eyes of our boy began to shine with malice, and a smile spread across his face when he said that he was being generous because Granul was the leader of the team. Granul felt somewhat confused. Vikir knew that Granul's poison could also be useful in the jungle and thought that he might be useful to them later. Granul closed his eyes and couldn't help but cry. He was thinking about that damn commoner. He, who had looked down on him so much, realized that Vikir was better than he had thought. He took the roasted meat and with tears in his eyes began to eat. His HP points went from 77 to 90. Vikir and the others stood watching in silent amazement. Later, someone shot an arrow at high speed, which lodged into the leg of a monster that was fleeing. The person who had shot the arrow was Vikir. Next to him was Granul, who extended his hands and with a gaze full of determination began to use his poison power. With their eyes shining with excitement, the triplets began charging at the monster. The monster with the shape of a bear and horse got enraged. It turned around and started to roar. But the triplets attacked quickly and started to cause wounds to the monster. Not long after, it lost its life and fell to the ground. Vikir revealed that they had already hunted 30 beasts. The triplets were happy since this was very easy. Vikir looked at the ground and revealed that if he wanted to secure a place within the top 10, he would have to hunt more. Granul's attention and his mind were filled with curiosity. He did not know why only Vikir hunted monsters instead of other students, since he remembered that hunting students gave more points. Vikir raised his head and sunk into his thoughts. Granul became even more curious, not knowing what he had in mind. Vikir's eyes began to shine. This felt familiar, the survival score, the score for hunting monsters, even the points obtained by making others fall behind, all of it was familiar. Even back then, he had avoided the gazes of others, caught the monster and obtained first place in the tests. That testing site also felt like home. However, his senses, enhanced after becoming a sword master and after entering the Red and Black Mountain inside the magic tower, were warning him for some reason. Vikir began to gaze toward the ground, not knowing what was happening. But he noticed that something was approaching. While they were distracted, not long after, something began to move toward them at great speed. Without losing a second, with a killer gaze, the triplets drew their swords and stood in front of Vikir. Our boy drew his bow, ready to attack. Granul with a confused gaze extended his hands and also prepared to fight. His eyes widened in surprise and confusion. He could not believe what his eyes were seeing. It was Sinclair, who now only had 38 HP points. Her body was full of scratches and her clothes were torn. She put her hands on her knees and with a gaze full of fear began to pant heavily. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, the spider madam opened its mouth and with eyes shining with rage, decided to attack. The Baskerville triplets began to move at great speed. Dodging the attacks, Vikir remained calm. Sinclair grabbed her magic staff with both hands and could not help but feel fear, while on the other side, Granville panicked. Lovegood Merlini was staring silently at Madam. Her eyes were full of fear. She did not know what this creature was. Seeing her expression, her friends panicked and asked her to react, insisting that they should flee immediately. While Vikir was fleeing the area along with the others, his gaze fixed on Madam and his eyes began to shine with seriousness, realizing that she was the cause of the unease he had felt since the moment he entered the tournament field. Vikir began to imagine a book, remembering that before regressing, the stories about Madam were nothing more than legends passed down as horror tales. It was only after multiple investigations that she was finally recorded in the Imperial Bestiary as an official magical beast, which meant that until then, there had been no reliable testimony from anyone who had seen her clearly. Even within the magic tower where the tournament was held, there were no precedents. He understood that this must be another variable caused by his return. All Madam's eyes were shining with malice. Vikir began to stare at it in silence. It attacked using one of its legs, and as the leg slowly approached, Lovegood Merlini became paralyzed with fear. Not knowing what to do, meanwhile on the other side, her friends drew their weapons ready to fight. Her eyes were full of terror, she couldn't move and couldn't believe she was going to be eliminated without being able to do anything about it just before the attack could hit her. Her team's tank, her friend, stood in front and used her shield to block the attack. But the difference in strength was too great, so she turned toward her with a worried gaze and asked her to step aside. Upon hearing her voice, Lovegood Merlini came out of her thoughts and her eyes widened in surprise. Luckily, she reacted in time and moved out of the path of the attack, causing Madam's leg to pass by her at great speed, destroying everything in its path. Once Lovegood Merlini turned around, her eyes widened in fear, leaving her in shock. Madam's attack was so powerful that it made Anna, her friend, crash into a tree. Her shield was broken and lying on the ground, and she was unconscious. Madam began to observe closely, and its mouth watered. Then the beast's eyes began to shine with excitement. Thanks to its sharp senses, it was able to detect the body heat of the other students who were in the forest. Without wasting any more time, it started charging towards them, passing by Wicker and the others. Randall fell on his butt to the ground, and his mind filled with surprise and confusion. He couldn't believe that it had gone somewhere else. He had thought he was going to be eliminated. Wicker, who was standing up, clenched his fist and began to observe Madam in silence. Our boy couldn't help but wonder if it was heading towards where more students were gathered. His eyes began to shine with concern. He couldn't help but wonder what the administration room was doing at this moment. He knew they shouldn't allow an entity outside of parameters to participate in the tournament. Vikar's thoughts were interrupted by Lovegood Merlini, who started running toward Anna to see if she was okay. Vikar turned toward them and became somewhat curious. Anna was injured, her body full of scratches, and her HP had dropped to 0. Lovegood Merlini's eyes widened in confusion and surprise. She couldn't understand why Anna hadn't been teleported to the waiting room if her HP was clearly at 0. The friend's eyes filled with fear. She couldn't help but panic since she didn't know how they were going to get out of this place now. She put her hand over her mouth and couldn't help but cry. While on the other side, Lovegood Merlini fell to her knees and began to gaze at the ground in silence, not knowing what to do now. With a confused expression, Randall began to walk toward them, extended his hand and asked what was going on, since it was supposed that even if they were eliminated, they should be returned to the waiting room. He put his hand on top of his head and started to go crazy. According to him, this made no sense. If a beast had appeared that did not meet the standards, he didn't understand why the tournament wasn't even showing signs of being suspended and wondered what the administration room was doing at that moment. Biker began to ponder in silence. Randall put his hands on top of his head, fell to his knees on the ground and went into panic. His eyes widened with fear at the thought that they had been abandoned. He came to the conclusion that the administration couldn't even handle the situation and had simply left them behind. Biker kept calm, drew his bow and asked him to calm down. Instead of calming down, Randall started screaming like a madman. He didn't want to die in this place. At the same time, someone made their way through the bushes and saw them. It was Dolus, Bakira and Hohenhe. Bakira, who had his sword resting on his shoulder, began to observe our boy in silence, while on the other side, Hohenhe began to show a calm gaze. Dolla's eyes widened with worry. She didn't know if they were okay. At the same time, in the administration room of the Magic Tower, the hologram turned red, Blue Whale, and the others panicked upon realizing that although the students' HP points had reached 0, they were not being teleported back. Now that one was injured, they decided it was better to get them out immediately. With a gaze full of concern, Vince Morg began to shout and ask Blue Whale to stop the tournament. Blue Whale's eyes widened with fear and confusion. He couldn't believe that a beast like Madam was in the forest and began to wonder if everything the Morg family had said was true. He began to gaze toward the ground with a confident expression, knowing that if the spider hadn't appeared, the Magic Tower could have won the tournament. Upon hearing this, Vince Morg couldn't help but clench his teeth tightly, without wasting any more time. He got up from his seat and started running. With an angry expression, he grabbed Blue Whale by the collar and asked him to stop the tournament immediately, asking him if he wanted everyone there to die. Upon seeing Vince Morg's attitude, Blue Whale couldn't help but feel somewhat surprised. With a sincere gaze, he revealed that this was not possible. Even if they tried to stop the tournament, it would not stop. Upon hearing this, Vince Morg began to stare at Blue Whale with a furious gaze. Blue Whale remained calm, explaining that an entity that even the Magic Tower had difficulty controlling had been summoned, causing an overload in the system and the loss of its control. Noticing that they could not enter nor could the students leave, with a worried expression, Vince Morg asked if there was any way to solve this. Blue Whale began to move his finger and started to point at a bright spot on the hologram. He began to imagine Madam with shining eyes and revealed that if this creature was eliminated in the tournament field, the Magic Tower system would return to normal. At the same time in the forest, Dollars sat next to Anna, who was injured, and using her powers she began to heal her. Luckily, as the HP shield was consumed, the impact had been slightly mitigated. Her eyes began to shine with tranquility. She turned towards Lovegood Merlini and explained that Anna was only unconscious for a moment, and if she rested well, she would be fine. Lovegood Merlini sat down beside, rested her hands on her knees and began to gaze at the ground with a lost look. She felt relieved to see that the situation here had somehow been controlled, but her concern immediately focused on the place Madam was now heading to. While Madam was attacking the other students, Dollar's attention was fixed on it. She hoped that the other students had not suffered harm. While she was trying to understand what was happening, Wicker, who was standing behind, began to ponder in silence. He began to look at the ground and his eyes filled with guilt, remembered that the monster Madam of 8 legs had a danger classification level S, a calamity of the type annihilation of nations whose mere existence was enough to break the wilt alive. He knew that this Madam was not the same as the one he had met outside the Magic Tower. She did not use her poison and all her multiple eyes had disappeared, which meant she now had blind spots. Her body, once impenetrable, showed holes in several parts. He suspected that she had been summoned to the tower with a distortion between the Madam of the past and the already dead one, as if she existed in an altered state of reality. Biker raised his head and his attention focused on someone. In front of him was Lovegood Merlini sitting and silently looking at the ground. Bakira and Hohenhe remained silent, not knowing what to do. Our boy clenched his fist tightly. He was aware that even though they could recognize those differences, There was no possibility whatsoever that they could defeat even a weakened madam. He knew they first needed to recover their will that had been crushed by fear. To avoid further losses and fulfill their objective, he had no choice but to use his power. Just at that moment, someone decided to go confront Madam. Upon hearing this, our boy came out of his trance and his eyes widened in surprise. Lovegood Merlini grabbed her magic staff and began to stand up. She knew she couldn't stay here, sunk in despair. Because of her complacency, one of her companions had almost lost their life and she was going to take revenge. Besides, she wanted to protect those who were still left and wasn't going to allow anyone else to get hurt. Her eyes began to shine with determination, making it clear that she was the president of the student council of the Masira. Someone forcefully drove their sword into the ground and mentioned that Lovegood Merlini's determination fit better with the students of boot camp Varangia. It was Bakira. With a confident smile he decided to help her face Madam. With a worried gaze, Dollars approached her and also decided to help. She knew better than anyone that they couldn't sacrifice the students in this place. Lovegood Merlini turned around and began to ponder in silence. Not far from them stood Hohenhe. Everyone's attention was fixed on him, not knowing if he would also help them. Bakira was honest, although he hated to admit it. He knew they needed Hohenhe's strength. Upon hearing this, a smile spread across Hohenhe's face. Under the moonlight, he adjusted his glasses and with a confident gaze mentioned that, although it bothered him, he would accept a temporary alliance just this once. It was all for the victory of the magic tower. Biker began to observe them closely. He had underestimated them, remembering that even during the era of destruction, they were the great heroes who stood at the front more than anyone else. A smile spread across his face. Biker caught the attention of the triplets, making their eyes widen with curiosity. With a calm expression, Vicar began to ponder. His eyes started to shine with seriousness when he gave them the order that from this moment on, they would be in charge of transmitting his message to others about how to defeat Madam Eightlegs. At the same time, Madam was chasing the students, who were running for their lives. Their eyes were full of fear and despair. One of the students tripped and fell face first to the ground. Noticing this, her friend panicked. With eyes full of fear and tears, she reached out her hand toward her friend, revealing that she had twisted her ankle and asking for help. Upon hearing this, the friend swallowed hard. He didn't know what to do now. Without hesitating even a second, he turned his back on his friend, closed his eyes and started running for his life, asking for forgiveness. With eyes shining with evilness, Madam began to extend its legs toward the girl, ready to attack her. The girl's eyes filled with tears, knowing that this was not good. Just before Madam could attack, someone attacked with a fire spell, saving the girl by a hair. The explosion created a curtain of smoke. Madam's eyes began to glow, and when the curtain of smoke disappeared, it could be seen that it was intact. The one who had cast the fire spell was Hohenhe. He began to stare at it and started to cast another spell, realizing that his fire magic had done no damage to it, even though insect monsters should be very vulnerable to it. Fire began to emerge from his magic staff, and his eyes began to shine with excitement. Behind Hohenhe appeared Dolus, Sinclair, and Granuel, ready to face the fearsome Madam. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, the Spider Madam opened its mouth and began to roar. Hohenhe extended his hand and invoked a magic circle, and not long after several bursts of fire impacted against the spider, Dolores and Sinclair, who were behind, were ready to help him. Hohenhe's eyes were shining with determination. He clenched his teeth and focused. He was not willing to give up so easily. Hibaro drew his sword and began to charge toward the beast. Sinclair grabbed her magic staff and with a confident gaze began to follow them. Dolores began to observe the spider in silence, not knowing how it was so powerful. Hohenhe was somewhat confused to see that there existed a magical beast immune to his fire magic, and not only this but also it was an insect type. With a serene gaze, Hibaro turned towards him and revealed that his magic was not going to work. Common flames would not cause significant damage and, unless he used the nether hellfire, it would be useless. Moreover, Madam's exoskeleton was too resistant for their attacks to penetrate it. He began to imagine Madam's weak points and his eyes filled with seriousness. He revealed that its legs, although relatively less resistant than the body, possessed a strange ability. If they were cut off, they regenerated and multiplied. Because of this, its only weakness at this moment were the already torn out eyes and certain parts of the body where the armor had been stripped away. While the eyes of Middleborough and Lowborough were shining with determination, they began to run toward Madam. Behind them were Vikir, Lovegood, Merlini and Bakira. Hibaro explained to Hohenhe that although his magic did not work as an attack, if he managed to attract the attention of the beast with it, the boot camp Varangia group would try to take advantage of the opportunity to attack its weak points. With a grateful expression, Hohenhe thanked him for the information and for planning the strategy, but at the same time asked him how it was that he knew all this. With a nervous gaze, Hibaro looked away, and while sweating, he made up a lie, explaining that he had already faced Madam in the past and that what he had told them was the result of the analysis he did back then. Upon hearing this, Hohenhe couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. He questioned whether, by following the plan to the letter, it would really be possible to defeat it. With eyes shining with evil, Madam opened its mouth and began to roar, and Hibaro confirmed that this was the only way to defeat it. It began extending its sharp legs toward them quickly. Hohenhe's attention fixed on it and his eyes widened in fear. He couldn't help but panic since he knew he wouldn't be able to distract it for long. At that moment, Lovegood Merlini began to walk toward Madam. She began to use the magic staff and mana began to emerge from it. While her eyes were shining with joy, with a smile, she began to spin her magic staff. She began to stare at the beast with a confident gaze and thought that with this attack she was going to be able to defeat it. She grabbed her magic staff tightly and struck the ground forcefully, making a magic circle appear. Not long after, vines began to emerge from the ground. With a furious gaze, the beast Madam began to attack quickly using its sharp legs. The vines that Lovegood Merlini had summoned began to call. The spider's attention was fixed on it and its eyes filled with confusion. It didn't know what was happening. The vines struck against its abdomen, causing it to start screaming in agony. While Lovegood Merlini's eyes were shining with determination, she continued using her magic and gave the order to the others to attack. Upon hearing her order, Middleborough and Lowborough drew their swords, gained momentum, and began advancing toward the spider. The Baskerville triplets and Bakira landed on top of its abdomen, focused themselves, and while mana was emerging from their bodies, they prepared to attack. Bakira tightly gripped his sword, and while his eyes were shining, He started staring intently at it and a powerful mana began emerging from his body. With a furious expression, Bakira began to shout, ready to attack. They attacked using all their strength, creating a great curtain of smoke. While the smoke screen was disappearing, they descended to the ground, began to observe carefully and did not lower their guard, since they knew that they were not going to be able to defeat it so easily. With a serene gaze, Bakira mentioned that with so much smoke he could not tell if it was dead or alive. Upon hearing this, Highbrow's eyes filled with confusion. Bakira tightly gripped his sword, and his eyes widened with confidence. Although he had definitely felt that his attack had cut it, he was not sure. Not long after, the shadow of something giant appeared in the sky. The attention of Bakira and the triplets fixed on it, their eyes filled with surprise and fear, leaving them in shock. The attention of Hohenhe, the Loris, Sinclair and Granui fixed on it, their eyes widened with surprise and terror. They did not know what was happening. While little by little the shadow was getting bigger, Lovegood Merlini could not help but feel fear. She was in shock. On the ground were Madam's legs. It stood up, and while its eyes were shining with rage, it began to roar. It began to stare at them and started to charge towards them. The spider decided to attack using its sharp legs. While the fierce madam was attacking, Hohenhe created a barrier around them to protect them from the attack. Madam's attacks were so powerful that they began to destroy the ground. Bakira and the triplets started running to avoid being hit. Middleborough turned around and upon seeing how powerful Madam was, clenched his teeth tightly and his eyes widened in fear. It was night and several minutes ago, Vicar met with the Baskerville triplets. With a confused gaze, Highborough extended his hands and questioned whether by following Vicar's plan they would be able to kill Madam. Middleborough and Lowborough began to observe our boy in silence. Vicar turned his back on them and revealed that it was impossible. With a confident expression, he made it clear that they already knew what it meant to face Madam. Upon hearing this, the triplets' eyes widened in surprise. While Bakira's hand was trembling, he began to ponder silently. Hohenhe, who was sitting down, began to tremble with fear. Everyone was afraid of dying. Not far from them lay Anna's body on the ground. Lovegood Merlini sat beside her and held her hand. Not long after, she stood up. Upon seeing this, her friend's attention focused on her. Lovegood Merlini turned her back on her friend, and while her eyes were shining with determination, she turned to her and asked her to take good care of Anna. According to Biker, the scariest thing was having the strength to fight and still standing by watching comrades fall. That's why he had chosen them. Even knowing it was an impossible mission and that they might not win, they would fight until the end. Just before Madam's leg could strike Lovegood Merlini, she extended her hands and summoned a barrier, which blocked the attack. She couldn't help but clench her teeth tightly, as she couldn't believe how powerful it was. She closed her eyes and began to cry, knowing that this was not good. At that moment, someone placed their hand on the ground, and red mana emerged from their hand and began to spread across the floor. The mana made the ground explode, causing Madam to stop attacking. Bakira's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. He could not believe that the ground the monster stepped on suddenly exploded. Highborough was in shock, but then his eyes filled with surprise, realizing that this mana was very familiar. Several minutes ago, Vicar turned to the triplets and with a serious expression explained that when he gave the signal, they should all attack together with all their strength. The triplets remained listening to our boy in silence. With a confident gaze, Vicar began to show one finger, revealing that this was the only way to defeat Madam. Hibaro realized that this was Vicar's signal. He gave them all the order to return their positions. This was the moment Madam had lost the opportunity to attack. Upon hearing the order, they began staring at Madam, and while mana was emerging from their bodies, they adopted an offensive stance, ready to fight. Dolores put her hands together and using her power, applied a buff on them. With a furious gaze, Hohenhe stood up and decided not to stand idly by. Sinclair, who was standing behind, focused. Lovegood Merlini began to stare silently at Madam. Hibaro started shouting, making it clear that they had to attack with all the strength they had left and with the determination to defeat Madam in a final assault. While the spider Madam was recovering from the attack, the triplets in Bakura began to charge towards it. While a powerful red mana was emerging from our boy's body, he began to gaze toward the ground and to stand up. His attention was fixed on it, and his eyes began to shine with seriousness. Lovegood Merlini used her power again, making a magic circle appear on the ground from which vines began to emerge. Dolores applied the light buff to Hohenhe. With an expression full of determination, he extended his hand and made a magic circle appear. He began to charge a powerful flame. The Baskerville triplets in Bakura appeared above Madam, ready to finish it. Our boy knew that someday they would become true heroes. Although they were not strong yet, they had not backed down, and it would be them who would put an end to this battle. They began to charge toward the spider. It decided not to stand idly by and decided to counterattack. Bikir drew his bow, aimed at Madam with it, and began to imbue his mana into the arrow. He prepared to shoot, and his eyes began to shine with confidence. He, better than anyone else, knew that heroes are not born, they are made. He could show them the way, but only they could walk it. Our boy concentrated his mana and shot the arrow. His attack was so powerful that the ground beneath his feet broke. Just before Madam could attack, Bikir's arrow cut its legs. It opened its mouth and began to scream in agony. Seeing that the beast was wounded, Bakura and the others realized that now was the time to kill it. The triplets in Bakura began to attack using their weapons, while on the other side, Hohenhe summoned a powerful flame which hit directly against its abdomen. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part,